Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight to our ACRO webinar. So tonight we have Dr. Daniel Golden, who's presenting Radiation Oncology Education Moving the Needle. Dr. Golden is an assistant professor of radiation and cellular oncology at the University of Chicago. He is also very interested in education, as everyone should know, as his presentation tonight, but he is one of the founding members of Right On Questions, as well as the Radiation Oncology Education Collaborative Study Group. So Dr. Golden, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and thank you to the ACRO Resident Committee for inviting me to talk. I appreciate the invitation, and hopefully everybody listening will get something out of this. So my talk title is Radiation Oncology Education Moving the Needle, and I guess the reason I chose this was just that I think that we're starting to see more academic productivity or scholarship in radiation oncology education, and so my goal is to give everybody listening the tools necessary to pursue formal scholarship in radiation oncology education. Just a couple disclosures. I'm the manager of Right On Questions, and then we also have a new website, HemOnc Review, that will be going online soon. So I actually want to use some interactive polls. This should be pretty simple, so everybody pulls out their smartphone, or if you have a computer, you can go to this, you can either go to this link, pollev.com/DanGolden293, or you can text. The number you text to is 37607, and then you text DanGolden293, and it'll allow you to join. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And then once you do that, you can send in any words that describe Chicago, and they should show up here. All right, somebody is successful. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds. This is just kind of a test. Windy and cold. I guess people are thinking Chicago in the winter. All right, well, for the sake of time, I'll keep moving forward, but as these, okay. Here we go, deep dish pizza. So I have more of these in here. The instructions will always be at the top, so if you haven't had a chance to figure this out or you decide you want to participate, you can always, again, this is the number to text to in the to section of your phone, and then this would be what you text to join. So we'll move on. All right, so let's just get a little bit more information about who's on the call. So what's your training level? So it looks like a majority are residents, and it looks like we pretty much stopped getting responses, so we'll keep going. We have, I'm guessing, one med student and one attending, so welcome to both of you as well. Where are you all located? Just give me an idea. A lot in the Northeast, so I'm glad some people decided to stay up late and listen. South, Midwest, West. All right, so we got covering a lot of the country. All right, we'll keep going forward. All right, starting to get more into education. So in the past, at any point, and this is a very loose definition, kind of it's up to you, but have you participated in medical education curriculum development? All right, so we're getting there, maybe almost 50-50 split. 2/3 have participated, 2/3 haven't. All right, so we'll keep going forwards. And then final question before we get into the content is the scholarship of teaching an equivalent scholarly pursuit to bench or clinical research. And there's something called the social desirability bias in survey statistics. Please don't put what you think I want to hear. I'm curious. I don't know who anybody is, anonymous response, so I'm curious what your thoughts are. We also have a probably a biased sample of people who've chosen to dial in and listen to this. But all right. So the goals and objectives, the goal and objectives for this talk. The goal, just the overarching goal, is to provide you with conceptual frameworks and tools to successfully pursue scholarship of radiation oncology teaching. And the objectives are that at the end of this talk, I hope you'll be able to define three basic types of curricula, identify fundamentals of scholarship, discuss the difference between scholarly teaching and scholarship of teaching, explain three models of curriculum inquiry, summarize a six-step model of curriculum development, describe two models to lead positive change, and then recognize examples of scholarship in radiation oncology teaching. So got a lot to cover, so we'll move forward. So general overview, I want to give you a brief overview of the history of radiation oncology education, at least as I see it. We'll talk about teaching versus a scholarship of teaching. We'll talk about curriculum development models. I'll give you a case example from some of my personal curriculum development projects, and then we'll talk about future directions. So the history of radiation oncology education, really you can't talk about it without getting into more of the history of medical education in general. I think most people would say modern medical education kind of started in the early 1900s. The AMA created the Council on Medical Education, which I believe has evolved into like LCME, ACGME, ACCME. And at the time, there were about 160 medical schools that had variable admissions criteria, resources for students, and curricula all over the country. Quick poll, who was Abraham Flexner? Was he an American educator who toured every medical school in 1908? Was he a physician at Johns Hopkins with an interest in improving medical education, or was he the sausage king of Chicago? All right, so he in fact was an American educator, so more people thought he was the sausage king of Chicago than an educator. He was not the sausage king of Chicago. That was Abe Froman from Ferris Bueller. Abraham Flexner was an educator, and he worked for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. In 1908, he visited all 155 medical schools in the United States and then put out a seminal report on the state of medical education in the United States and Canada. He recommended reducing the number of medical schools by about 80%, down from 155 to 31, increasing the prerequisite center medical training. He recommended training physicians to practice in a scientific manner. Recommended giving medical schools control of clinical instruction in hospitals and strengthening state regulation of medical licensure. There were some pretty significant impacts. Between 1910 and 1935, about half of the medical schools in the United States closed or merged. Admissions requirements became much stricter. Length of training became standardized. He's really credited with creating the single model for U.S. medical education. State licensing also became much stricter. There were some negative impacts. At the time, I believe there were 8 historically backed medical schools, and all but 2 of them closed. There was also a reversion for a few, 2 or 3 decades to male-only admittance. There had been a few schools accepting women. But I think you also have to think about it. Did we, in general medical education, kind of become accustomed to a one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter medical education? Not to disparage what we do now, but I think if you look at a lot of different levels of medical education, things are very similar, and there's a lot of room for innovation and trying new methods. And in some ways, I wonder if Flexner kind of set in stone what was considered acceptable medical education and kind of created that attitude. History of radiation oncology education. We used to train as therapeutic radiologists, so everybody would do a radiology residency. The Department of Radiology at Yale is still called the Department of Therapeutic Radiology. And in the 1960s, the Medicare Act funded graduate medical education. There was an explosion of graduate medical education programs. And I think that coincided with radiation oncology being recognized as a pretty distinct specialty from diagnostic radiology. But we split into 2 specialties, and there was the establishment of a lot of radiation oncology departments and GME programs. And nowadays, we have about 90 GME programs in the country. I think the last count, it might be about 92. So I want to change gears a little and talk about teaching versus a scholarship of teaching. So to talk about this, we need to talk about what is scholarship. And if you look at the basic definition of scholarship, it's academic study or achievement or learning of a high level. But there is another seminal report put out, and I want to point out here, it's key to note that the Carnegie Foundation again funded this, and this was from Boyer, called Scholarship Reconsidered. Now, this wasn't just for medical education. This was actually for scholarship for all universities. And what he said was that the goal is to move beyond the teaching versus research debate. So there's an old saying: if you can't do, then you teach. And the idea was that research and teaching were two distinct entities, and teaching was not necessarily scholarship. And what he proposed at the time was that they need to, in higher education, develop a reward system that reflects the diversity of institutions and the breadth of scholarship. And it was actually developed through a large survey gathered from about 5,000 faculty at all types of higher education institutions. And they came up with a definition for what is scholarship. And Boyer's definition was that there is scholarship of discovery, which would be original research that advances knowledge, say discovering a new protein. Integration, which would be synthesis of information across disciplines, topics, or time. This could be a review of the literature. It could be using existing techniques to develop a new technique. Application, which goes beyond the service duties of faculty, involves rigor and application of disciplinary expertise with results that can be shared with and or evaluated by peers. And then Boyer defined teaching as a separate avenue for scholarship, and said there's the systematic study of teaching and learning processes. It differs from scholarly teaching because this requires public sharing and an opportunity for application and evaluation by others. Subsequently, in academic medicine, Glassick kind of modified or discussed how do we assess scholarship in medicine. So there's standards for assessing scholarship, and I think this is key if you're thinking about doing an education project, is if you want to make it scholarship of education, you need to meet these standards. So number one, you have to have clear goals. You have to have adequate preparation, appropriate methods, significant results, effective presentation, and a reflective critique. Oftentimes I try to think about how would somebody doing bench research or clinical research go about a project, and if you're going to do educational scholarship, you need to apply the same rigor, both defining a hypothesis, what are your goals, what are your objectives for what you're going to do, prepare for it adequately. I think too often I see people, and I'm guilty of this too, kind of rushing into an educational program because it's exciting and new and you want to apply it to your learners, and you end up not preparing adequately for how you're going to evaluate it and eventually disseminate it. Methods and then also results need to be thought through carefully so you have something to present in manuscript form. And then reflective critique. You have to be able to think critically about it. What were its weaknesses? What were the limitations of what you did? And then how can you move forward? Glassick also discussed further, how do you separate scholarly teaching from the scholarship of teaching? So to be defined as scholarship of teaching, the work must be made public. The work must be available for peer review and critique according to accepted standards, and the work must be able to be reproduced and built on by other scholars. And there's another seminal paper in medical education by Fincher and Work where they modified Boyer's definition of scholarship, and I think this figure is key. So when we think about teaching and education, there's teaching. That could be saying, I'm going to give a lecture on small cell lung cancer and getting up and giving a PowerPoint on small cell lung cancer. Great, you taught somebody, but was it scholarly teaching? Scholarly teaching would be applying best practices, almost like evidence-based education. How do you most effectively engage your audience, your learners, so that they learn and retain the information, which is your ultimate goal. That's still not scholarship of teaching. Scholarship of teaching would be developing a novel curriculum to teach, say, fundamentals of small cell lung cancer, evaluating it, and then publishing that so that your peers around the country or even internationally can review it, they can adopt it or adapt it, and then build on that. So you can see here in this manuscript, they say the scholarship of teaching builds on the process of scholarly teaching. The common elements of all forms of scholarship are peer review and public dissemination. And then the scholarship of teaching has the potential for advancing the field, not just as individual students, not just individual students learning. So they actually then say, well, based on this, teaching really isn't a separate form of scholarship. Teaching should be considered the same as all other types of scholarship. In the scholarship of teaching, you can have discovery, integration, and application. So that you can see from the paper, scholarship of teaching is not a fourth distinct form of scholarship, but rather may involve these three avenues of scholarship for like all other types of scholarship. So just a quick review. Which of the following are used to define a work as, quote, scholarship? A, the work must be made public. B, the work must be available for peer review and critique according to accepted standards. C, the work must be able to be reproduced and built on, or D, all of the above. And I realize I can't tell how many people are responding because I'm hoping everybody answers D. So we'll keep moving. So yes, so the correct answer is D. Everybody got 100%. Great job. So again, the work must be made public. The work must be available for peer review and critique, and the work must be able to be reproduced and built on. One way to think about this, again, in the context of clinical research would be, imagine if at your own institution you developed a novel treatment for cancer, either radiation or systemic therapy or combination therapy, and you never published on it. And nobody else would know about it. And the only patients who would be treated with it would be those that happened to walk through your front doors and get treated at your institution. That would never go on in clinical research or bench science. But in education, it happens a lot. People have really good ideas. They do novel educational curricula or projects, but they never publish it, and it doesn't get disseminated for peer review and critique, and also to be built on. All right, so we talked about teaching versus the scholarship of teaching. I want to talk a little bit about curriculum development models. So basic definition of curriculum is the subjects, or are the subjects comprising a course of study in a school or college. This actually I would call the set curriculum. So there's actually three types of curricula. If you talk to, if you look at education theory in any educational setting, the first is a set curriculum. This is what you get when you enroll in a course in college, the syllabus that they hand you. This could be the goals and objectives that you receive when you start a clinical rotation as a resident. This could be the goals and objectives at the start of an ACRO webinar. That's the set curriculum. Then there's something called the hidden curriculum. And I don't have a poll in here, but I'm guessing many of you have heard of the hidden curriculum. It's the kind of the socialization into whatever group you're learning to be a part of. For example, in medicine, it's often talked about in a negative light, but it can be positive and negative. So it could be in negative, it might be seeing a surgeon throw a scalpel in the operating room. As a medical student, you learn, okay, I can throw a scalpel when I'm an attending surgeon. But there's a lot of positive aspects to the hidden curriculum. Sitting in a consultation with one of your attendings and hearing how they counsel a patient who has a new diagnosis of metastatic cancer. That's not something necessarily defined in your set curriculum, but you're going to learn how to engage and how to accomplish that. There's actually a third type of curriculum that I find most people haven't heard of called the null curriculum. And the classic example of the null curriculum, or the definition is it's what's not taught in the curriculum, either the set or the hidden curriculum. And an example of the null curriculum is art and grammar school. So it's not net neutral if I say that I'm not going to teach kindergarten through fifth graders about art. The theory is that it's actually negative. By not teaching them about art, you are teaching them it's not important. They don't need to know about art, and therefore they will value art less later in life. And I often think it's interesting to think about what's in our null curriculum, either in general medical education or in radiation oncology education. There was a paper published, I guess, 40 years ago, which I think is still very apropos today, called The Diseases of the Curriculum. I encourage everybody to look this up and read it. It's pretty entertaining. But Abrahamson defines 9 diseases of the curriculum: curriculosclerosis, carcinoma of the curriculum, curricular arthritis, curriculum dysesthesia, iatrogenic curriculitis, curriculum hypertrophy, idiopathic curriculitis, intercurrent curriculitis, and curricular ossification. And I think we've probably all seen these during our medical training in one form or another in different aspects of our training, whether it's hardening of the categories in medical school, where you're you're always going to learn about the same systems. Not to say that's wrong, but sometimes it maybe needs to be changed up as our major diseases in society are evolving. Carcinoma of the curriculum, where there's an uncontrollable growth of one segment or component of the curriculum. And I can think of examples both in our specialty and in general medical education. And I'm not going to go through all these in great detail, but I encourage you to read the paper and think about how these might apply to radiation oncology or oncology education in general, or any other educational curriculum that you're interested in. So with that background, I want to discuss 3 curriculum inquiry models, or curriculum development models. The first one is called the systematic model. This is structured, kind of defined steps to accomplish developing a curriculum. A downside of this is traditionally this has been top-down. The deans or the course directors say, okay, I'm going to develop a curriculum, I'm going to follow these steps, and then I'm going to implement it with my learners. There's the deliberative curriculum inquiry. This is less structured, and involves all stakeholders. And examples of this would be, many of you may have been, or some of you may have been involved as medical students on your curriculum committee. So the idea here is that you need all your stakeholders to be involved with developing the curriculum, because the deans of the medical school may not understand exactly how modern medical students want to learn or what they should learn. You may involve patients, you may involve nursing staff. There's a lot of different stakeholders. In radiation oncology, an example is the Program Evaluation Committee, which is now mandated as by the ACGME. And a requirement is that at least one resident member is serving on the committee. And that's an example of having stakeholder involvement so they can be involved in deliberative curriculum inquiry. The third model, which I'll be honest, I'm not overly familiar with, is called the revisionist model, and it explores how our curriculum relates to society. One key thing to point out here is that these are not mutually exclusive. You can use any or all of these together. And often, in my experience, combining especially number 1 and 2 is very beneficial. So I want to go through an example or a conceptual framework for how you can do systematic curriculum development. And I love this cartoon. I love the Far Side, but I also love this cartoon because it really speaks to what systematic curriculum inquiry is all about. So first pants, then your shoes. And this is the this Bible of curriculum development, I would say, for medical education, at least for the systematic approach. This is the newest edition. It used to be Kern, so you'll hear Kern's 6 steps, but Thomas has now taken over as the lead editor, so I just call it the 6-step model. So curriculum development for medical education, a 6-step approach. It's not very expensive on Amazon. I think it's under $40, and if you have any interest in curriculum development, surveys, anything like that, I highly recommend picking this up and looking through it. It's a very readable book. It's only a couple hundred pages. So this is their overall model. They define 6 steps. Number 1 is problem identification and general needs assessment. Number 2 is a targeted needs assessment. Number 3 is goals and objectives. Number 4 is educational strategies. 5 is implementation, and 6 is evaluation and feedback. And one thing to notice with this figure is that the arrows all kind of interconnect. So these all relate to each other. You don't always have to start with number 1. Oftentimes, people will have a great idea for an educational strategy, or they may have a goal that they really want to accomplish. But I think it's key then that you go back and forward and pay close attention to all of these steps so that you don't miss anything. Remember, we talked about scholarship has to be, you have to define methods, clear goals, and significant results. So if you start with a good educational strategy and you jump straight to implementation, you're very likely to miss these 3 steps. You may find out if you do a lit review that somebody's already done something similar, or maybe there's something you can build on. You may find out through a survey of your learners that it needs to be tweaked a little so that it's optimal and they actually want to do it. And then if you define your goals and objectives, it may help you develop your educational strategy and make it a little bit more focused. All right, so just a general poll. I'm curious, everybody listening, which of the 6 steps do you find most challenging, or do you think would be most challenging if you haven't attempted curriculum development in the past? I should say in full disclosure, this is my first time using poll everywhere, and I've learned my lesson that if I put percentages, I won't be able to see if people are still responding. So. All right, so I think looks like most folks have responded. Oh, still got a couple stragglers. All right, so I'm going to lock it. I think it's interesting if we look at this, the problem identification and general needs assessment, educational strategies, and implementation were the only three that got rated. There are ways in this software, I guess I could have had you sort them. I don't know how it would have worked, but I do tend to agree implementation can be the most challenging. There's political hurdles to get it implemented. There can be funding issues. Just getting time in a curriculum to do something can be a challenge. It's interesting, educational strategies. I often find goals and objectives to be the hardest to define. The strategies often I find are easier to kind of figure out and decide, oh, that's my personal. And then problem identification, I guess identifying the initial problem maybe is a challenge, just getting the idea of what needs to be addressed. Evaluation and feedback, didn't get any scores, but this is often challenging too. How do you evaluate a educational strategy so you get meaningful data that's going to give you both significant results and also be of interest to a potential reviewer or your peers or the community at large? This often, for me, is one of the most challenging things to obtain. So if we apply the 6-step model and apply scholarship to it, there's a lot of opportunity for scholarship throughout these steps. A general needs assessment and problem identification, a systematic literature review is a great way to pursue scholarship and do kind of a general needs assessment. One's been done in radiation oncology to teach people about brachytherapy, how to do a prostate implant. You can do a full literature review. It may give you enough even to write up an entire paper, or it may be just kind of the introduction to a manuscript subsequently. But oftentimes you can do a systematic literature review, which has clearly defined methods, or something called the PRISMA statement that outlines how to do one of these reviews. And if you follow that, you can often publish just that by itself. Targeted needs assessment. I think everybody on this call probably has seen these in one form or another, but most of the surveys you get are examples of targeted needs assessment, trying to assess how much you're learning about safety or contouring or evidence-based medicine or resilience. I mean, there's a whole litany of things you can think of. But other methods would be a focus group, sitting down with a group of residents or your target learners, medical students, patients, individual interviews with targeted learners. And these often as well can be published as an individual piece of scholarship. Goals and objectives and educational strategies alone, one way to publish them is through MedEd Portal, which is on the AAMC, or through the AAMC, and it's a peer-reviewed repository of medical education materials. There's very few radiation oncology materials on there, but it's something to consider. And then implementation and feedback, which is where you'll see peer-reviewed publications reporting outcomes of an educational intervention. And I should just mention here, I always kind of half joke that I think there's a 7th step to curriculum development, which should be dissemination, getting this out there into the literature so other people can build on it. Oops, sorry. All right. So in summary, curriculum development, you have the 6-step model. I think some keys I've learned in the last few years since I got into this to successful curriculum development are to work in a logical sequence. It takes real time and effort. So you need to put just as much effort into designing surveys for needs assessments and evaluations for your program as you put into designing your educational strategies. You need to make sure to map specific objectives to a specific educational strategy to your evaluation. Otherwise, you'll find out when you get your surveys at the end that you don't have data that actually supports what you set out to achieve with your objectives. Don't skip steps. Don't implement until all pieces are in place, and then collaborate. I think education's a great opportunity for collaboration, both at your own institution as well as across institutions. And then one last kind of side note here before I get into a case example of what I've done is I think leading change. Education is in some senses or is different than clinical or bench research where there's often a lot more politics involved to just implementing and leading change. You're trying to change a curriculum that's oftentimes been in place for years, and how can you achieve that? So there's two models that I like to think about, both from professors at Harvard Business School. One is Rosebeth Moss-Cantor. She has the 6 keys to leading positive change. It was in a TED Talk that she gave. I have the link here. Show up, speak up, look up, team up, never give up, and lift others up, I should say, others. But the other one is John Cotter's 8-step process for leading change. So you can create a sense of urgency, build a guiding coalition, form strategic vision and initiatives, enlist a volunteer army, enable action by removing barriers, generate short-term wins, sustain acceleration, and institute change. And notice that this is circular. You can kind of continue to follow this cycle over time. All right, so we've kind of gone over a history of radiation oncology education very briefly, talked about the difference between teaching versus scholarship of teaching, and talked about different curriculum development models. So I want to give you a case example of what I worked on, and then we'll talk about some future directions, and then take any questions. So my example, most recently, I ran an objective evaluation of a didactic curriculum for the radiation oncology medical student clerkship. And this is a project I've been working on now since 2012, and I'll kind of give you an overview of how this has gone. So just a general problem identification and general needs assessment, which I guess I did back in 2012 when I initially started working on this, is that medical student rotations are often supplement clinical experience with structured didactics. So internal medicine, surgery, EM, derm, urology, and palliative medicine all have published curricula for their clerkships, but I found back in 2012 and then again in 2013, I ran I called a national needs assessment where I surveyed applicants to the University of Chicago residency program, which we estimate is probably 80% of applicants on an annual basis, about their experience in clerkships. And we found that the majority of them reported not receiving structured didactics. There's a very high degree in variability in the clerkship educational experiences. Just to give you some numbers, for example, in the first survey we ran in 2012, we had about 70 responses with about 200 overall rotations completed. And out of those, more than 50% the students said they received no structured didactics at their level, whereas 90% of the clerkships, the students gave a lecture to the department. And this, I don't want to get too far into this, but this kind of speaks to this. Are they being used as audition electives, or are they being used to educate the students about radiation oncology? We also then asked in our second survey for students to rate how well prepared they felt to function as a radiation oncology resident. And we were able to show that using a Likert type scale, this is 1 being not at all, 2 is slightly, 3 is moderately, 4 is quite, and 5 is extremely. Students that had completed a clerkship with formal didactics rated themselves as moderately prepared with a range from moderately to quite, versus students who hadn't had formal didactics rated themselves also as moderately, but the range was from slightly to moderately, and it was statistically significant. We were able to publish both of these, the initial pilot needs assessment as well as the larger one in the Red Journal. Based on that initial assessment, needs assessment, we developed a pilot curriculum, which we initially implemented at University of Chicago and Harvard. Consisted of 3 lectures as well as a hands-on treatment planning workshop. I'm guessing some of you that are residents may have gone through this during your clerkship rotations. We demonstrated it was feasible to implement and got favorable subjective student evaluations. We only had 18 evaluations, so the next challenge was we needed a larger cohort. How could we show that this actually was statistically significant and students felt that they benefited from this? So our solution was to kind of follow the clinical research model of doing a collaborative group study. In glioblastoma, for example, the incidence is only 2 to 3 per 100,000. But in the STOOP study, they were able to enroll almost 600 patients at 85 institutions. And you end up with a nice graph that looks like that. So we developed the Radiation Oncology Education Collaborative Study Group and expanded our pilot curriculum to 11 academic medical centers. And I actually was not aware at the time of that model that I talked about, Cotter's model for leading change, but in retrospect, I feel that creating the curriculum and recruiting this was kind of enlisting a volunteer army by developing this semi-packaged curriculum that could kind of be plug and play at institutions. We helped to remove barriers. We published on this, which was generating short-term wins. And so in that next year, we were able to have 94 students complete our curriculum, with 64 completing evaluations of the curriculum. Now, this was only subjective evaluation, so the students were asked the usefulness of each curriculum component. You can see the introduction lecture, rad bio and physics, practical aspects, and the hands-on planning. And the median for all of these was that it was extremely useful. We also looked at, in a subsequent survey of all the applicants to our program, which we've been running every year now, this will be our 6th year, we showed that students that completed one or more clerkships at one of the ROCSIG institutions reported greater post-clerkship confidence, both in their radiation oncology knowledge as well as their ability to function as a radiation oncology resident. And this was also published in Journal of the American College of Radiology, which, if you're looking for a venue for education scholarship, has been very friendly. And actually, if you read their masthead, they include education as one of their publication goals. So the problem was that all the data from 2012 to 2015 had been subjective. It was students telling us that they liked the curriculum, it was useful, it made them more confident. But I had submitted that initial the initial 11 institution curriculum to the Red Journal, and it was rejected. And their main criticism was, this is great, but we want objective measures that show that this is actually beneficial. So with that in mind, we developed a hypothesis in 2016. We said that students who complete a radiation oncology clerkship with a structured didactic curriculum will, and we had 2 phases to this project. In phase 1, we said they will show improved fundamental radiation oncology knowledge at the end of the clerkship compared with the beginning, and greater fundamental radiation oncology knowledge compared with a control group not exposed to our curriculum. And then in phase 2, we wanted to show that they would have improved long-term knowledge retention of fundamental radiation oncology knowledge. So from July through November of 2016, we expanded this. We now had 22 institutions participating. We had developed a 20-question multiple choice knowledge assessment, which had actually initially started as 66 questions, and through a iterative process, we pared it down to 20 validated questions. And before and after the clerkship, each student completed this 20 question set. Site coordinators at each institution were also able to provide step 1 scores linked through unique respondent IDs. They were de-identified, so I only could see an anonymous identifier and link that to pre and post tests, as well as USMLE scores. I couldn't identify any students. And we did all our centralized data collection in REDCap at the University of Chicago. That's another just kind of little nugget I would recommend everybody. If you have interest in survey, you should investigate if REDCap is available at your institution. I want to say it might even be at over 1,000 institutions now. It's funded through the NIH, but individual institutions have to sign up for it. But it's a very powerful survey tool. It's completely free. It's HIPAA compliant, and it works just as well as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or any of the other survey tools that charge. For phase 2, we redid our clerkship survey. We included a $5 gourmet coffee card, which was actually a Starbucks card, but Starbucks says you can't call it a Starbucks card, as incentive. And we included the validated 20-question multiple choice test. Students were asked just to identify if each rotation was at one of our ROCSIG institutions, and we also collected data in REDCap. Data analysis, we used descriptive statistics, paired and unpaired t-test, Pearson correlation coefficient. We also calculated something called the effect size, which is the mean of your experimental group minus the mean of the control group divided by the standard deviation of the entire group. Basically gives you the number of standard deviations above or below your control group that your experimental group is. So with this example, if the effect size is 1, that means that our experimental group was 1 standard deviation above the control group. An effect size of 0 would mean that our intervention had 0 effect. An effect size of -1 would mean that the experimental group was 1 standard deviation below. Time since first rotation, USMLE step 1 scores were analyzed to see if that interacted with scores on the test, and it was approved as exempt by UIC and University of Chicago. Another key point, if you're doing education research or scholarship, oftentimes it's exempt and you don't need to apply for full IRB approval. If you have questions about that, feel free to email me later. I'd be happy to explain more, but many times you can get this accepted as an exempt investigation. So the results from phase 1, we had 146 students complete the curriculum. We had 109 paired pre and post tests for about a 75% response rate. We looked at the 85 students receiving the curriculum de novo. So about 20 of the students actually were completing the curriculum for a second time, so we excluded that data. And we ran something called Cronbach's Alpha, which looks for correlation between the questions. So if somebody gets everything right, except one, basically it's if people get one question right, are they getting the other questions right? And an alpha of 0.66 for 20 questions is actually reasonable. We also showed there was no significant interaction with USMLE score or with time from first rotation. So this was the key here, or kind of to prove our hypothesis. So number one, remember our first goal was to show that students post-rotation would have a higher score than pre, and we showed that they increased by about 16%, from 64% pre-rotation to 80% post-rotation. If you look down at the bottom here, students that had no prior rotation increased more dramatically from 55 up to 77%. If they had had a prior rotation at a non-ROCSIG site, it was statistically significant. They went from 69% to 82%. The interesting thing was we looked at that group of 24 that had previously completed a rotation, and they did not show a statistically significant increase, which, as a kind of side note, raises the question, should students be repeating rotations? Should they be doing 3 rotations? Is that educationally beneficial? The effect size overall was about 1. If they had no prior rotation, it was 1.6. And prior rotation at a non-ROCSIG site, it was a little bit, so the students seem to be learning something. They're coming at a, at a higher baseline, but they still improved significantly. And then prior ROCSIG rotations, there was a fairly small effect size. For our second goal, remember, we wanted to show that if you completed a clerkship at our site, at one of our sites, did students do better than those who had completed clerkships at other sites? So what we did was we took the post-assessment for people like student A that had completed only a clerkship at our site and compared it to pre-assessment scores for students who had completed clerkships at other sites. So you can see student A post-assessment has just as much rotation time as student B and half as much rotation time as student C when they take their pre-assessment. So we felt this was a good comparison. Not perfect, but good. So we compared this group to this group. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor. And what we showed was it was statistically significant. So overall, students who completed no prior rotations and did their first rotation at one of our institutions scored 77%, versus students who had done 1 or 2 prior rotations at non-ROCSIG sites scored 69%, with a t-test p-value of 0.01, and an effect size of about 1. So this supports our hypothesis that having the curriculum in the clerkship is going to improve fundamental knowledge of radiation oncology. For phase 2, we surveyed the applicants to our program. At the University of Chicago, we had a 35% response rate. And the effect size seems to be mediated, but there was a difference, 66% if students had not rotated at any of our sites, and 72% if they had. And this is a one-tail t-test, in full disclosure. But I think we can argue that's reasonable because we can assume that the test score would only go up by having the curriculum. And so it barely meets statistical significance if you do that. So some discussion about this. The data support previous subjective findings that structured didactic curriculum improves resident knowledge and preparedness for residency. We do see a diminishing benefit with increasing number of clerkships for knowledge transfer. Some limitations: the curriculum may not have been uniformly presented across institutions. Interestingly, only 70% of ROCSIG institutions were reported as having lectures at the medical student level in our late assessment with the survey, so months after. Now this may have been a recall bias, students may not have understood, and there is still a marked difference between our institutions, 70% being reported as having lectures versus only 20% of non-ROCSIG institutions. Another question is, was the survey incentive the primary motivation for completing the survey? So we did have one student complete the survey who said they had rotated at a ROCSIG institution, who scored a 20% on their multiple choice question test. And when I looked at that specific data point, they had answered B for all of their questions. So, there are some imperfections to doing survey research that are hard to overcome. And then lastly, there are biases in the institutions participating in ROCSIG and potentially the students selecting these institutions for rotations. In conclusion, though, we've shown that multi-institutional curriculum development, implementation, and evaluation is feasible. A structured didactic curriculum objectively improves end-of-rotation knowledge compared with traditional clerkship models at the early and late time points. And there does seem to be a diminished benefit of the didactic curriculum for students completing greater than one rotation. Future directions, overall goal is to continue to collaboratively develop curricular innovations through ROCSIG. If you're interested in ROCSIG, it's free to join. You can go to this website or just email me directly and I can explain a little bit more, but it's a somewhat informal group. There aren't any specific requirements other than just letting me know you're interested in education, and I basically add you to our list. So thinking back to Glassick standards for assessing scholarship, I like to think that I met these. I think I had clear goals, adequate preparation, used appropriate methods, demonstrated significant results, effective presentation, and reflective critique. And then also was this scholarship of teaching or scholarly teaching. Well, I made the work public. The work will be available for peer review and critique, and it will be hopefully reproduced and built on by other scholars. I should mention that these data were presented at ASTRO last year, and I'm in preparation. I should be submitting it to the Red Journal in the next couple of weeks. We'll see if they look on it more, if they have a more favorable view of it now that there's objective data. So future directions for radiation oncology education. I think number one, we need to evaluate and refine the radiation oncology SEC curriculum. So what are we aiming to teach our trainees, medical students, residents, even attendings through CME? Also, I've started to think a lot about patient education as in the same light as medical education. We have a curriculum, it's just a little different. We're trying to teach patients about radiation, what to expect at our consultations or on treatment visits or even at follow-ups. And we can apply a lot of the same methods to patient education development. We need to define and address the radiation oncology hidden curriculum. I don't know if I can think of off the top of my head at least publications specifically discussing the hidden curriculum in radiation oncology. I'm sure there is one. And then we need to disrupt the radiation oncology null curriculum. So what are we not teaching that should be taught? And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but just in my mind, what are some fundamentals of radiation oncology that are being taught or maybe not being taught that we could teach more of? I'm not going to go through them individually, just for you to kind of look at. So I want to do another one of these word clouds. What area of radiation oncology education needs the most attention? And so you can submit words or phrases. I believe you can submit multiple times. So if you have multiple ideas, you can send them in. We'll see what shows up. I'll leave this open for a minute. Brachytherapy, that's a big word. So I don't know if everybody understands how these work. The bigger the word is, the more times somebody sent it in. Those of you, you can also look and feel free to add the one, send in ones that your peers have also sent in. So you can look at what's been job search, I'm guessing maybe people sent in. All right. So I see biostats, I see practical, which I think is an interesting word on here. Billing is one that I've always thought often is avoided in radiation oncology residency, but it's practical and needed. Proton, plan. All right. Okay, so I locked that. Just a final word is that curriculum development is not a straight line. It's kind of an endless loop. I always liked MC Escher, and I think this is how you should view curriculum development. You're never going to get to the end or the top floor. You just kind of keep trudging up the stairs, and hopefully along the way get some publications and impact some learners and help people learn. So an overview of what we talked about a history of radiation oncology education, teaching versus the scholarship of teaching, curriculum development models, gave you a case example, and talked about future directions. And for goals and objectives, again, the goal is to provide you with conceptual frameworks and tools to successfully pursue radiation oncology curriculum development. We talked about 3 basic types of curricula. Remember the set, hidden, and null. Curriculum, we identified fundamentals of scholarship, discussed the difference between scholarly teaching and scholarship of teaching, talked about 3 models of curriculum inquiry, the systematic approach, deliberative approach, and revisionist approach. We talked about the 6-step model, specifically of the systematic approach. Talked about Cotter and Moss-Cantor's models for leading change. And then hopefully you now have some tools to recognize good examples of scholarship of radiation oncology teaching. So I wanted to end with this survey again. Is the scholarship of teaching an equivalent scholarly pursuit to bench or clinical research? And I will not be offended if anybody says no, and it's anonymous. All right. So that's the end of the talk. I hope everybody found it useful and informative. I do want to give a quick plug here. I haven't actually even announced this formally to the ROCSIG members, but we are going to we're going to have a spring symposium on Friday, June 1st at the University of Chicago. It'll probably be late morning, like 10:30 to about 5. That's actually the first day of ASCO. So if anybody's coming to Chicago for ASCO and they're interested, they could come to this as well. It will be free, maybe a very small fee for food, but if you're interested, again, get in touch with me. You can email me or contact us through the website, and it'll be a probably series of oral presentations with a keynote speaker and some social event in the evening just to kind of get people together. So anyway, I'm happy to open up to questions. I don't know, Karna, if you want to field them or how we want to do this.
Yeah, so if anyone had any questions, just ask them in the question box. Just a couple of questions for you actually is that I think, what do you do for, grant funding, and how do you, get funding for these educational projects? I know through ACRO, we actually started because we found that for our radiation oncology residents, we didn't really have much education funding, and we have this education grant, but like when you're in the attending level, trying to do research in the education field.
Yeah, so so when I started as an attending, I was fortunate enough to get the RSNA Education Scholar Grant, which funds $75,000 a year, and it can be used for salary support. So I actually, my first year, was able to get that for 100% salary support. That is a challenge. There isn't tons of money out there for educational work. There are some other smaller grants, like you mentioned. There's some different things through the AMA. There's another funding mechanism called the R25 through the National Cancer Institute, which is a cancer education grant, or research education grant. So the trick there is that if you do it, you have to justify, or it has to be linked to cancer research education. So it can't just be teaching clinical fundamentals or clinical skill. That has to be actually teaching research education. It could be clinical or basic science. And I have an application revision for that, but that's another place. I think the other thing is that if you're productive, at least at my institution, I've written manuscripts and been academically productive. I get a protected day a week to do academic work, and obviously I'm sure the department and institution would love me to get grants and fund it, but they're willing to let me have that day to do what I'm doing because or at least I believe I've been productive doing it. And there are plenty of people who do clinical research that isn't funded as well. Whether it's SEER reviews or NCDB reviews, or even I think much of the clinical research that goes on, the attendings often aren't receiving direct salary support for that. So part of it also is looking for an institution that'll be supportive, or a chair that'll be supportive of it, so that you can pursue something like this and not have to worry about losing all of your protected time if you don't get funding. I don't know if hopefully that answers your question somewhat.
One of the questions is kind of like what can you do as a chief resident during the research year, I guess, both in terms of like helping medical students as well as kind of like for education purposes, kind of, I guess, developing educational ideas or research.
Yeah, so I actually, during my research year, when I was a PGY4, noticed that the medical school offered called the Merits Fellowship at our institution, Medical Education, Research, Innovation, Teaching, and Scholarship. They have to have a catchy acronym. And it was a one-year program every other week for 2 hours, where we had some lectures on the background of medical education, educational theory, how to do evaluation. Actually funded us to go to the AAMC meeting that year in Denver. And that kind of gave me the initial foothold with kind of basic curriculum development theory, which I subsequently did a master's program. But I would advise, if you're interested in this, look around your institution, because there's often programs designed to teach residents or junior faculty about this kind of stuff. The other thing is just to find an attending mentor who's interested in this. If there's a particular gap in your curriculum, or maybe an area that you think could be improved, or you have an idea for a novel educational method, find an attending mentor and kind of champion that'll support you pursuing it. And then again, there's kind of a whole political aspect to education and curriculum development. So you have to get an attending on board who then will tell your chair, hey, this is a good idea, we should do this, it'll make our residency look better. And I think the other thing is, don't try to bite off too much. Start simple. Whether it's doing a survey or implementing a simple small curriculum change. It might be a new type of lecture or some sort of whatever it might be. But if you try to get too overzealous, it might be hard, because resource-wise, you may not have the resources, you might not have the time to do it. Your program director or chairman might say, well, we can't let residents out of clinic for your idea. So sometimes it's kind of you got to get your foot in the door, start small, and then over time build on that, and kind of generate more momentum.
All right. Another question is, during your curriculum development, did you find something interesting or surprised while you're developing it?
I mean, I guess in the last several years, I kind of had this vision of maybe doing collaborative education development, and I guess I've been surprised by how it's kind of really gained traction, and we are still doing this 6 years later. I guess also maybe pleasantly surprised with how it hasn't been that hard to find people at institutions to kind of champion my particular project, like the medical student clerkship. And my hope is that going forward, so this last summer we piloted a PGY2 introductory curriculum that was developed by Rachel Jimenez at Harvard, Emma Fields at BCU, and Rafael Yachieli at Miami. We did that at 4 institutions, and we're hoping this summer to expand it to more institutions. So I think I kind of had this idea, and I've been pleasantly surprised that it's actually been somewhat successful, being able to start these projects and then expand them and see them. Now I think might almost have half of the programs around the country using our clerkship curriculum, maybe a third to half, which, is affecting kind of significant change across the country, not just at a couple institutions. So I guess that's been pleasantly surprising that that's been successful.
So actually, one of the things we found, so we redid our curriculum. It's actually interesting that, we found that people in radiation oncology who actually are interested in radiation oncology really didn't, they're pretty smart. They have all the answers. But actually, the people who were not interested in radiation oncology had the biggest change in, test scores and actually learning from the curriculum. Did you guys look at that, or thoughts of change, trying to expand your curriculum?
So we've kind of started adapting it so we used at least pieces of it for the PGY2 curriculum. At my own institution, I use it for any students that come through our program, and actually I also use it for fellows. So we have surg-onc fellows, gyn-onc fellows come and rotate through, and so I'll have them often watch the lectures that I have on YouTube and then do the hands-on planning workshop. I use an adapted version of it for medical oncology. That's one area. There was a paper from UCLA recently where they surveyed internal medicine residents and basically showed that nobody knew anything about radiation oncology. So there's a lot of room for getting our specialty out. And then also Malcolm Matties at West Virginia with, I want to say, Bill Small and Nahav Epiwala just wrote an article called, I forget the exact title, it's something like Out of the Basement and Into the Something Light, talking about ways that we can get radiation oncology into the general medical school curriculum, because we're often absent from the general curriculum. So not all students get a lecture about radiation oncology during medical school, and so they go off and practice primary care or gynecology or neurology, and they really have no clue about what radiation is. They think we push buttons all day, turn the machines on, or they think we do interventional radiology. And I think that's another area that we really should be looking at is making sure that the rest of medicine understands what we do and that it's a valuable therapeutic modality. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying that I agree that it can have just as much impact, if not more, on the students that aren't going into radiation oncology. So yeah, I mean, it's, and that's the kind of application idea. So maybe I publish on using this for students going into radiation oncology, but somebody else out there might kind of adapt it and then say, well, we adapted this for our, entire M3 class, and it was rated highly, and, the vast majority of students aren't pursuing radiation. That's not something that I pursued, but somebody else could, and that would be an example of kind of building on my scholarship for their own scholarship. So.
And the article you were talking, it's called Out of the Basement and Into the Classroom, Pathways for Expanding the Role of Radiation Oncology, Oncologists and Medical Student Education. It's in Journal of ACRO. Yeah.
So they actually have a whole table in there with kind of passive ways that you can teach and active ways. There's a whole bunch of different ideas about how you might be able to kind of get radiation into the general curriculum, because I can say my own experience, it's very challenging even as a faculty member to get somebody to give you a little bit of time. You know, and this is when you go back to those diseases of the curriculum. You know, you kind of get this curricular ossification where everything's just locked in stone, and trying to get your foot in the door just to give one lecture is, you know, like a monumental feat. And I think we can see, no matter how small or big the curriculum is, if you look at those, quote, diseases of the curriculum, you can often find that at least one or more of them apply to any given curriculum. You know, this is just my personal take, but in some ways I feel like our own specialty, we've had kind of a curriculum hypertrophy of the evidence. Not that evidence isn't important and we all have to know it, but often the tests and education focuses so much on the evidence. Are we missing out on learning the practical aspects of how to treat, how to assess a plan, how to implant a brachytherapy case? You know, and so, you know, no matter where you look, I think you can, a curriculum is never done. That's the other thing, is you're never done with a curriculum. It should always be, when you think you're done, that's when it's time to go back to step one and say, what are the problems with my curriculum, and how can I, you know, what kind of needs assessment can I do, and how can I build on this? So.
All right, and one last question. So last question is, our program is very small and may get 3 to 4 medical students total over the entire year. Do you have strategies for teaching smaller versus larger groups? I feel teaching one resident/med student per class versus 4 to 6 can be a big difference.
Yeah, so I actually will give the same set of lectures if we have 1 student or if we have 4 students at a time. I think it's up to the instructor or educator to decide what kind of atmosphere they're going to set. So if it's, you know, if I have 1 student, I'll often do the lecture in my office at a computer screen, and we'll sit there and I try to at least make it a relaxed environment, encourage them to ask questions, and oftentimes I believe they really enjoy it because they can basically one-on-one ask me whatever questions they want. Now, if you sit in a big lecture hall and have 1 student sitting in front of you and you drone on for an hour and then say, okay, that was the lecture, they probably won't enjoy it too much. But in some ways, having the 1 student can be a really enjoyable teaching experience and learning experience. So I would encourage you to think about still giving lectures even when it's 1 student. Same thing with the hands-on planning modules or you know, other educational methods. Sometimes having the 1 student can be fun for both the teacher and the learner, but it's up to you to set the atmosphere so that it's a comfortable learning environment for them, and they can feel comfortable asking questions and engaging you.
Thank you again for this great presentation, and thank you again for your time. And if anyone has any questions, you can email him to, you know, especially if you want to join the education study group. So if you have any final words, you can.
No, yeah, thank you everybody for taking time out of your evening, and feel free to get in touch.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks.